Hi guys, Miss Francis here to continue our discussion on evolution. We're now going to explore speciation. So what is speciation? Well, what do you think the first species looked like? Was it prokaryotic, eukaryotic, anaerobic, aerobic, single-celled, multicellular? Did it produce its own food or did it need to find food? Was it aquatic? Was it terrestrial? And more importantly, how did we end up to have so many billions of different types of species now? Well, before we can understand speciation, which is the development of new species, we had better define species. So species are when individuals within a population can interbreed and produce a viable, fertile offspring. Now let's take a look at these two examples. Check out these birds. They look extremely similar. By appearances, you'd say they probably belong to the same species. However, they have different mating songs, which prevents these birds from interbreeding. They're actually members of two different species. But now look at this image of humans. That's a very diverse group of humans, yet we belong to the same species. We can interbreed and produce viable, fertile offspring. So what I'm trying to say is that species are based on interfertility, not physical similarities. And there are many factors that lead to speciation. The first vocabulary word that we're going to become familiar with is reproductive isolation. Reproductive isolation prevents populations from different species from interbreeding, where these reproductive isolation techniques are called reproductive barriers. And there are two types of reproductive barriers. You've got prezygotic barriers and postzygotic barriers. Prezygotic barriers are exactly what that word seems like. It's preventing or being a barrier to fertilization before the zygote actually forms. So it's impeding mating between species, between different species, or hindering fertilization if those members of the different species attempt to mate. And there are 5 different types of prezygotic barriers. They're nicely represented in this chart. And on, I think it's page 3 of your note packet, there's actually a really nice graph of all of these reproductive isolation mechanisms. So the first prezygotic barrier that I want to discuss is called habitat isolation, where different habitats, species living in different habitats or organisms living in different habitats are usually unlikely to encounter each other or even to attempt mating, which is exemplified by garter snakes, because even though they might occupy the same area, one lives in water, one lives on the land, so they rarely encounter one another. Behavioral isolation is another type of prezygotic barrier where many species have elaborate behaviors such as mating songs or mating dances in order to attract your mate. A key example are the mating dances of the blue-footed boobies. Blue-footed boobies can only mate with other blue-footed boobies. They can't mate with a red-footed booby because the mating dance will only be recognized by other blue-footed boobies. The birds of paradise does a specific mating dance where only other birds of paradise belonging to the same species will recognize and respond to that mating dance. Temporal isolation is another prezygotic barrier, which is a type of reproductive isolation. So let's say I've got species that breed during different times of the day, or even different seasons, or even different years. So for example, when it comes to plants, you've got annuals and perennials. Annuals mate annually. Perennials mate every other year. The western spotted skunk and the eastern spotted skunk. Western spotted skunks mate in late summer, whereas eastern spotted skunks mate in the late winter. Mechanical isolation is another prezygotic barrier, a type of reproductive isolation. Now, mechanical isolation is when the male and female reproductive parts are just anatomically incompatible, making the transfer of sperm impossible. For example, many insects, the male and the female reproductive organs don't fit together, preventing the transfer of sperm, therefore preventing fertilization, which prevents the formation of a zygote. And lastly, gametic isolation, which is another type of prezygotic isolation, prezygotic barrier, occurs when the gametes of the two different species, don't fuse together correctly. So the egg from one species and the sperm from another species, for example, don't fuse. If they don't fuse, I can't fertilize the egg. If I can't fertilize the egg, I cannot form a zygote. Now, the other type of reproductive isolation barrier is a post-zygotic barrier. This occurs after I form a zygote. So let's say if sperm from one species does happen to fertilize the egg or the ovum of another species, these post-zygotic barriers prevent that hybrid zygote from developing into a viable, fertile adult. And those barriers include reduced hybrid viability, reduced hybrid fertility, and hybrid breakdown. So reduced hybrid viability means that the genetic incompatibility between the two species can stop the development of the hybrid at some point within the embryonic stage, or the offspring that are produced are so frail that they don't normally survive. Reduced hybrid fertility is when you've got two different species that interbreed, but the offspring, the hybrids, are infertile, and that hybrid cannot backbreed with either parent. So for example, the mule is a hybrid of a donkey and a horse. That mule is infertile. It can't breed with other mules, nor can it breed with the horse, nor can it breed with the donkey. The liger is a hybrid of a lion and a tiger. A geep is the hybrid of a goat and a sheep. Well, now let's say that hybrid, for some reason, is fertile. That first generation hybrid is viable and it's fertile. So when they mate with each other, which is possible, the offspring are either feeble or sterile, so they don't really survive. So let's say I have a plant like cotton. Now, most of this hybrid breakdown occurs in plants. Cotton can produce fertile, so two different cotton species can produce fertile hybrids, but the breakdown occurs in that next generation when the offspring of the hybrids either die as seeds or grow into weak and defective plants. So this image, which appears in your note packet, is a really nice summary of reproductive barriers, both prezygotic barriers and post-zygotic barriers, because these reproductive barriers can occur before mating, between mating and fertilization, or even after fertilization.